Okay, so let's talk about giving a function to another function as an input. Now, if you are giving a function into another function, or a function is returning a function, that is what we call a higher order function. And I'm going to show you a few flavors of and examples of how this could work. So here we have an ES6 function which takes in a single parameter called myfunc, and then it calls that function inside of itself and then returns whatever that function is going to produce, if anything at all. If it's not returning anything, it's just going to return undefined. So the function is named foo, and here we can see I create a function called bar, which is going to log out bar and then a line over here. And on this line here we call foo and give bar as the input. So what's going to happen is that it's going to come in here, we're going to call it, and then that's all that's going to happen. So if we now go to my console, you can see here at the top bar, and that little line is being printed out. And that's the basic concept of how this works. Now, this is a fairly trivial example that doesn't do anything that all that useful. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how this is being used from some of the native functions that you'll find in JavaScript. And the most common place you'll use these types of patterns or higher order functions is on that's on the array functions, right? So as you can see here, I have my array, which is just 1, 2, and 3, and then I do a map, and we know since before that a map is going to it's going to iterate over all of the elements and do something to the elements and return the results. And in this case, it's going to be a number, and we're going to take that number and then we're going to do +1. So we expect this to be 2, 3, and 4. And if we go back here, you can see that the first log here is 2, 3, and 4. So that's sanity check done. Then we have a filter, which is going to return only the things that pass a certain criteria. So in this case, we're saying, hey, return only things that are greater than 1. So if the number is greater than 1, return it. And as you can see here, 2 and 3 are the only ones that are in this array. So what is next? Oh, sorry, yeah, reduce. Here we are. So reduce is a little bit of a special one. So reduce is going to take a so-called initializer or an accumulator. It's going to iterate over the array, and it's going to reduce all of the values inside of that array down to something. So in this case, it's just going to sum everything up. So it's not going to return a new array, it's going to return the sum of all the values in this array. So you have a lambda function with an accumulator and the number. So at the first iteration, this accumulator is going to be that 0 here, and then it's going to take this number here, and as you can see, all it does is that it takes the number and it adds it to the accumulator, which is going to mean that you're going to add all of these numbers up here, and then we're going to log the results, which is 6, as you can see here. Okay, so those are some like what we call lambda functions there, and it's very common in JavaScript in this community that almost everybody is making everything a lambda function. But I wanted to show you that that doesn't have to be the case, especially not for map, filter, and reduce. And if I'm being a little bit opinionated, I would actually say that, you know, do it if it makes sense, but try to make name functions, because it's much easier to me, or rather I prefer reading it myself. So here we see that these are the same functions. So we have a +1 function, that's this function over here. Put that into a constant or a variable. GE1 stands for greater than 1, which is this anonymous function here, and then you have a sum here, which is the exact same thing as here. And if we now look at this line here, this functionality here, this is doing the exact same thing as what we saw earlier, but to me, I mean, this, in my opinion, is a little bit more readable, and also if you're into test-driven development and stuff like that, it becomes easier for you to not only read this, but also test it. Right, and that's what's being logged out. As you can see, these two things are completely equal, and that's because they're doing the same thing. It's just that one is using the lambda functions and the other one is using named functions. Now, as a final treat, I'll show you how to make a what I call a pre-programmed function. This is also a higher order function, and let's just walk through this. So we have a function that takes a number, and then it returns a function that takes another number, and that function is going to take the first number and the second number and add them together and return that result. So this is a pretty cool thing. If you're doing some type of filtering where you're like looking for a condition or something like that, it can be very useful. Like if the evaluation is always the same, it's very useful to create this, like, almost it's a function factory if you want to get really technical, so that you can generate functions that are all like they're almost exactly the same, but maybe they use a different comparison or something like that. So this is great for creating new functions. So what's going to happen here is that when JavaScript parses this information, it's going to run this function, which is a 1. So it's going to return a function that knows that, okay, the next, if somebody calls this function here, whatever number you're calling that function with, add 1 to it. And then we have an add2 function, which does the same thing but with a number 2. So you can see here that now add1 and add2 are functions, and I can call add1, which is going to be 1 plus 1, and then I can call add2 with the 2, which is going to be 2 plus 2 because of what we're doing up here. And if we go to the terminal, you can see 2 and 4 as we expected. So hopefully this is a very brief and simple introduction to how it works when you give a function as an input to another function.